Welcome to CODEPINK's webinar on COVID-19 in Brazil and President Jair Bolsonaro's response to this pandemic. My name is Leonardo Flores. I'm one of the Latin America campaign coordinators for CODEPINK, and I'm joined today by Professor María Luisa Mendonca, a visiting scholar at the Graduate Center of CUNY in New York, and the director of the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil. Thank you so much for joining us, María Luisa. So let me start with the first question. Can you talk about what the latest figures are for COVID-19 in Brazil? And if there widespread testing and are there enough beds and ventilators?
Yes, well, the latest figure that I saw just today is that there are 31,000 cases, confirmed cases, and almost 2,000 people have died. And but the University of São Paulo has a study saying that this number should be multiplied at least for 12 times more. Wow. Also the number of beds available in hospitals are almost at capacity all over the country, at 90%. And in emergency care, beds also is reaching its capacity of, it's about 75% already. And also there have been more informal reports saying that the number of deaths, for example, in the city of São Paulo is increasing. And so, many people are estimating that because there are not tests available, in a massive way, so probably the number of deaths and the number of cases are much higher.
Wow, so it sounds like Brazil might not even have hit the peak yet, or at least certain parts of it. And we've seen several reports where President Bolsonaro is almost like a denier of the impact that COVID-19 can have on health and people. Can you tell us a little bit about his response to this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. It's absurd, if it was not tragic. And of course, it's very tragic. He's been saying that this is a lie created by the media. It's a fantasy. So, and he's been out on the streets and inviting people to go out, to go back to work. And now there is a battle between him and the state governors, because all state governors in Brazil are united now to implement social distance. And even right-wing governments and left-wing governments now agreed that they're going to just ignore what Bolsonaro is doing and implement state policies so people would stay home. This is the recommendation by all state governors in Brazil. But the federal government is still trying to, put out information. Bolsonaro keeps saying that people should go out. And also the government tried to put out a propaganda campaign telling people to go out, and then that was blocked by the justice system. So, there is a constant battle in Brazil to save lives, as the federal government is pushing people to go out and, with very dramatic consequences.
And it also seems like there were splits within Bolsonaro's own executive branch, right? With the health minister being one of the people urging for more stricter measures. And he was recently fired just yesterday, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the former minister Mandetta, also, who is a right-wing person and supported Bolsonaro all the way along. But recently, he was very critical of Bolsonaro and was urging people to stay home and try to implement, the isolation measures. And then his staff, many members of his staff decided to resign, and then just yesterday he was fired, and then the new minister now is defending not complete isolation, but just certain people that are more vulnerable would be then staying home, which of course, can create a problem as well, because we know that many young people can be asymptomatic and still can spread the virus, for example. And imagine the consequence of this in a favela, right? In a poor neighborhood where people don't even have access to running water, to sanitation. So this can have drastic consequences. Already we have seen a contamination in an isolated indigenous community in the Amazon. So, the indigenous movement is also very concerned, saying that this could mean genocide for indigenous people. So even, in urban areas, but also in rural areas, the situation is very dramatic.
And you talked a little bit already about how there's this difference between what the federal government is doing and what individual states in Brazil are doing. Are there some that are doing well in your estimation of handling this disease, or is pretty much the whole country overwhelmed or about to become overwhelmed at this point?
Yes, I mean, the state governors already see that, the health system is reaching a capacity. Just to give you an example, the governor of São Paulo, the largest state in Brazil, the most populated state in Brazil, he's a right-wing governor who supported Bolsonaro, and he said that he is dealing with a war against the virus, but also he's dealing with a war against the federal government. So, and this is a former supporter of Bolsonaro. So, yes, I think that it's making very difficult for people to react, and in a way similar to what's happening here in the United States with Trump, doing everything to undermine the efforts from state governors. So it's almost like, Bolsonaro, he tends to copy Trump in many ways. And it also seems that both administrations here and in Brazil, they just don't care, if people of color die, if people in the favela die, if people who are dying are, working class people, indigenous people, people of color. So, so I think that it might be even their goal, So it's scary. It's very scary. Bolsonaro is also encouraging churches to open, for example. He tried to include churches as essential services, and then the courts, he lost in courts as well. So, at least there have been some resistance from the legal system and from state governors.
Yeah, and you mentioned these interesting parallels between Trump and Bolsonaro, and I think the parallels right now between the United States and Brazil go very deep. In the US, we've seen anti-quarantine or anti-shelter-at-home rallies in Michigan and in Virginia. We saw something similar happen earlier this week in São Paulo with a right-wing rally against social distancing. Is this something that's happening throughout Brazil? And is it indicative of kind of an ideological divide? I know you said that some right-wing governors are taking measures, but are their voting base supporting them, or is the right-wing voters kind of more with Bolsonaro at this point?
I think it's the more extreme portion of Bolsonaro's supporters, right? I mean, he won the elections with more support than he has now. Now probably he has less than 30% of support, and his support is more in certain parts of the country where you see more white people, because Bolsonaro lost the elections in the north and the northeast part of the country, but it was again, it was tragic and comic at the same time, because what we saw was people going out in very fancy cars, not actually walking out, walking around, but very expensive cars, on the streets, asking people to go out. Basically, those people were not getting out of their cars, but they were asking other people to go out. Basically, the divide is pretty much a class divide, because also, who are the people who can afford to stay home? So this is another key question that we see here in the US as well.
Yeah,
because for
and you
essential
mentioned
workers, it's very difficult to stay home. So that's why we see, the contamination affecting low-income people more.
Yeah, and you mentioned a bit earlier that Bolsonaro's support is at about 30% now compared to when he was elected. When we had talked about this interview earlier in the week, I had proposed the idea that Trump had been saw kind of a bump in his approval ratings, but the latest polls to come out show that Trump has now lost significant support over the past month. Has the same happened in Brazil with Bolsonaro? Is his popularity going down as a result of his mishandling of this pandemic?
Yes, I think so, because there is a portion of people who supported him who are more educated, but bought into the idea that they had to get rid of the Workers' Party, right? There was a lot of media manipulation against the Workers' Party. And of course, that started when there was a parliamentary coup against President Dilma 2 years ago, supported by the mainstream media. And also there was a huge campaign on social media with fake news, against the Workers' Party. So then, there was a vacuum created, and the traditional right-wing candidates were not able to occupy that space. So, the result was this far-right candidate, Bolsonaro. But now I think some people, the more, let's say, moderate portion of his supporters now are, it's clear that they are more aware of what is happening. So again, Bolsonaro is losing support even among right-wing politicians, and also parts of a proportion of people who voted for him is not supporting him anymore.
And I'm glad you mentioned the Workers' Party. The last I saw, former President Lula da Silva, who's from the Workers' Party, was one of the most popular, if not the most popular politician in Brazil. Is he taking a role in helping people through this pandemic? Has he been visible throughout this ordeal?
Yes, he's been very visible. He's giving a lot of interviews to the press. Today, there is an interview with him in The Guardian, a good article. And he is, of course, opposing Bolsonaro and saying that, the most important concern now is to save lives. So because Bolsonaro, again, is the same, is trying to copy Trump, saying that the economy is more important than people. And so Lula is being very vocal, and, and it's also, it's good because he has international visibility as well. So yes, hopefully, he will be able to be more influential.
Mm-hmm. And earlier you had talked about, sorry.
During the election, it's important to mention also that Bolsonaro only won because Lula was in jail, right? Although there is no clear evidence against him, he was put in jail, so he was not able to run. But even when he was in jail, his popularity was higher than Bolsonaro. So clearly, if he was able to run, he would win the elections. And so, Bolsonaro is a result of this political vacuum.
And so is Lula still positioning himself to run in the next elections? Is that your sense?
No, I don't think so. He probably, the Workers' Party probably is going to prepare another candidate. Fernando Haddad, who was the candidate against Bolsonaro, he got 44 million votes and Bolsonaro got 55 million votes. But Haddad only had 40 days to campaign because until very late, Lula was still hoping that he could run. So when the Supreme Court was, didn't allow him to run, then the Workers' Party had only 40 days to come up with another candidate. So even with, in a very short period of time, Haddad got a very large percentage of the votes. So I think that again, I think in a different context, this would not have happened.
And going back to the pandemic, you mentioned earlier how it's disproportionately affecting the poor and Black people and Indigenous people. We're seeing the same thing in the United States, of course, where Black people and brown people and Indigenous folks have a higher mortality rate from COVID. So the same is true in Brazil, and what steps are being done to protect these populations?
Yeah, I don't think we have the data, enough data to say that, the exact numbers, but yes, I mean, probably, when we have more data, this is what we're going to see, because many people who are dying probably of coronavirus were never tested, so they are not counted in the data. So, but of course, if you live in a low-income community with no access to basic services, even to running water. So these are the populations that are at a great risk. Also, people who need to go back to work, who work in informal jobs. So yeah, they are much more vulnerable.
And so I'm glad you brought the fact up that some people need to go back to work, or some people already are going to work, especially those who work in the informal sector. And I think, Bolsonaro's response is all about maintaining Brazil's economy going. And we saw similar comments made by the president of the central bank recently, who said something I'm paraphrasing, but he said that the economy would be better if people die faster or something to that effect from coronavirus. But are the states that are taking stronger measures, are they taking also measures to mitigate the effects of the economic impacts on the poor?
Yeah, the opposition parties just passed legislation to guarantee a minimum income for the whole population for 6 months. And this is a proposal that the Workers' Party had even before this crisis, to propose a minimum income, which can also stimulate the economy, right? Because the social services, we cannot see them as costs. We need to see them as investments, because when people have a basic income and spend on basic needs, right, on food, on essential services, then that also stimulates the economy. It has a multiplying effect in the economy. So, I think this is the type of policy that we need to put forward here in Brazil and in other countries.
And so we're getting a question from one of our YouTube watchers. The question is, what is the situation in jails, and are there social movements fighting to get prisoners released?
Yes, this is a very good question. In Brazil, the jails are in horrible conditions, overcrowded, this is a main concern for social movements as well. And the Black movement is being very active in Brazil, also, asking for protection of people in jail and also in low-income communities. And, there is a lot of organization at the grassroots level as well. People are protecting themselves. The social movements are organizing. The MST, for example, in rural areas, the landless workers movement is donating, tons of food to low-income communities as well. So, this is, I think, those types of initiatives of solidarity, this is something that I think, we need to support right now.
And before the coronavirus hit, I know that in Brazil, there were many attacks on the MST, which, as you said, is the landless movement, and other social movements, especially environmentalist and indigenous movements. Have these attacks sort of continued, or has there been kind of a pause as the nation deals with COVID?
Yes, I mean, the mainstream media and the conservative parties have been attacking the MST for many, many years now. And, but the movement keeps surviving because now, and I think that it's important to point out that this crisis makes it even more visible that we need to support small farmers. We need to support local agriculture, the production of healthy foods, at an accessible cost. So agroecology. So in this case, for example, there is no treatment, right? So how is the main way that we can protect ourselves, how we can protect our immune system, is having a healthy diet. So, it makes it very clear that we need to support small farmers, ecological agriculture, that this is key for public health. Another important point is that we need to protect biodiversity, and the expansion of agribusiness, large plantations that destroy the environment and are based on chemical inputs. This is a main cause of the destruction of biodiversity, which has a huge impact on public health as well. So I think this is a time for us to connect these dots and to raise more awareness about what should be a priority, in terms of, defending, linking environmental protection with basic rights, social rights, economic rights, and hopefully more people will be aware of that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up biodiversity and the environment, because we just got another question related to that. The question is, what is happening with the rainforest and environment right now? Is the situation causing a reduction in rainforest destruction? Could this be a silver lining? I think as we're seeing, throughout the world, as our waterways become cleaner from the lack of economic activity. So is something similar happening in terms of the Amazon being, less under attack at this moment?
No, not really. I think that because people are paying attention to something else, the illegal loggers and the land grabbers are attacking local communities in rural areas, and the deforestation is actually increasing. So yeah, this is another concern. How do we protect rural communities? How do we protect the land? Because the environmental destruction is only going to make the situation worse.
I think you talked earlier about how we had a member of the Yanomami tribe, an indigenous tribe in the Amazon, who contracted COVID-19. I mean, it's speculation, of course, but is it possible that it was related to this logging and to these kind of illegal land grabs in the rainforest?
Yes, Bolsonaro just approved, for example, mining in indigenous lands, which can have a devastating effect. The indigenous movement is talking about genocide. So yeah, it's a very dangerous situation we have with Bolsonaro, and it's a huge threat.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so many parallels between the US and Brazil, because we're seeing the Trump administration go after indigenous lands as well during this pandemic.
Exactly. Yeah. And, and giving more flexibility to environmental laws, like, Trump did as well. So, yes, I mean, the thing is, there are so many fronts, and I think it's part of their strategy. It's like the shock doctrine. There is so many things going on that sometimes people get paralyzed because they don't know how to react.
So given all these parallels between Trump and Bolsonaro, and I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but which one is worse in your opinion, now that you've been in the United States for a couple of years and you know both of them pretty well and their policies?
Well, I think in the US, the institutions are stronger. There is more checks and balances here. You have a stronger legal system. You have a Congress that is more progressive than the Brazilian Congress. So I think that it's easier to mobilize here. There is less repression. For example, people can go out on the streets and protest, and in Brazil, there is more repression. The dozens of indigenous leaders have been killed, for example, in the last year or so. So I think the level of repression and the fact that, especially after the coup against President Dilma, all the institutions in Brazil suffered, right? So I think that makes us more vulnerable, and that's why Bolsonaro is even more dangerous. Also, he appointed military officers in almost every sector of his government. So even if he resigns or if he gets impeached, we ended up with pretty much with a military government at this point. So yeah, it's a very dramatic situation. Also Bolsonaro, there are also investigations that link him with paramilitary groups, militia groups, even some people involved in the assassination of Marielle Franco in Rio. So, it's a very extreme situation. I'm not saying that Trump is much better at all. And I think that we need to see this as a global trend, right? Steve Bannon is connected with Bolsonaro's son, for example. They are part of a global organization, a global movement to push forward a certain agenda, a global agenda. So that's why we see so many similarities in terms of their discourse. So I think that the right-wing forces are organized at a global level. So I think that's why I think that the work of CODEPINK is important, is very important, because you connect the dots, you work at an international level. And so, because it's not enough for us to do domestic work right now, given
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You're totally right about right-wing forces not just rising throughout the world, and especially in Latin America and the United States, but also how they work together, because we see, Bolsonaro and Trump just patting each other on the back consistently and supporting each other in any way they can. But going back to something you said a few minutes ago about Bolsonaro's relationship to the military, a couple of weekends ago, we saw rumors that there was a coup about to happen in Brazil, that the army was going to place Minister Walter Braga Neto as the acting president. Were these just rumors? Is there something behind that? I mean, how stable is Bolsonaro's government at this point right now?
Yeah, nobody knows. We have seen these rumors, coming out several times now. And again, I think that Brazil, our political situation is very unstable. The economic crisis is getting worse and worse. And Bolsonaro is implementing very radical structure adjustment policies. Basically, he's getting rid of any type of labor protection. So the situation is going to get worse. He's cutting social programs, safety nets. So it's difficult to predict what is going to happen. But the military in Brazil, so far, in recent years, doesn't seem to have an interest in going back to power. We have seen, the years of the Lula and Dilma government, there were, cordial relations. And I think that the sector of the military that supports Bolsonaro is the more extreme sector, but that is a more moderate sector of the military that doesn't seem to have an interest in having instability, political instability in the country. So at this point, I think the question is, how are these forces going to, if there is a battle within the military, I think we don't know what's going to happen. So it's difficult to predict what's going to happen.
And one final question. What can we do here in the United States to support the Brazilian people, not just during this COVID pandemic, but during this the tenure of Bolsonaro as well?
Well, fight against Trump. I think this is very important, right? Because the Trump administration has a horrible effect in foreign policy all over the world. And, it's a key support for Bolsonaro. And also supports social movements in Brazil, rural social movements, the Black movement, the women's movement, the indigenous movement in Brazil. So, and I think that we need to come up with common agendas as well, the same way that the right-wing forces have a common strategy. Progressive forces, social movements around the world need to build a common agenda as well and support each other.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been Professor María Luisa Mendonca, a visiting scholar at the CUNY, at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and the director of the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil. Thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone that was watching. We'll be back soon again with another webinar. We'll let you know.